Hey everyone, we're here for our next session, and it'll be on how to make NFTs not stuck. And I'll let Addie take it from here.
Hey everyone, I'm Addie Wagenicht. Welcome to my talk. I'm here to give a brief background about myself really quickly, just so you kind of understand how we ended up here, as well as some thoughts on why NFTs are sort of, for lack of a better term, a gateway drug to crypto, and some low-hanging fruit about how this can be accelerated from a developer and marketplace or business development point of view. So the background about me is important because it informs sort of the decision matrix in which I have advised and built out multiple kind of well-known established NFT marketplaces and continue to do so. So I'm going to try to basically give everyone like a 10-year summary of my life in 1 to 2 slides. So just bear with me. This image will make sense in a second. So essentially somewhere between getting a job and being really interested in open source software growing up in university and in grad school, and feeling like I wasn't necessarily ready to have a job that involved an open floor plan, I decided to look into residencies. And being mildly interested in art and obviously studying technology, my background was sort of perfectly ripe for art and technology incubators. So when my background, I guess, dissolved into this, I started looking at sort of opportunities around where I had gone to grad school, which was New York City. And I ended up applying and going to a place called I-Beam, which at the time was sort of in the epicenter of Chelsea. And if you're not familiar with New York, Chelsea is essentially the epicenter of the art world. At least it was at the time. Now it's kind of spread out a little bit more. And we had access to a fabrication lab. So the fabrication lab was open 24/7. What this basically meant was when you gave a lot of people access to professional fabrication equipment, there was a lot of fires and alarms, and quite often we became good friends with the firefighters. So one of the things that came out of that, which I think was really pertinent in sort of how I got into NFTs in the first place, is that I fell into a group of other artists and researchers at the time. It was roboticists, graffiti writers, techie people who were interested in art curious, and we became a group called Fat Lab. So what this meant from the outside was that we made essentially a lot of public work and public installations around IP and Creative Commons. And this image you see is actually a Google streetcar, which we completely fabricated. It was fake in the sense that it didn't actually do the image mapping and all of that, but like the lights would rotate, all of the cameras were there. We 3D printed everything. We set up the rigs, and we would drive these streetcars sort of in atypical ways around the cities and disrupting, and sort of with the goal of like having people question, I think, the very system and companies in which everyone said or thought we could kind of blindly trust at the time. So there was little awareness about the power of big tech at that point, and sort of how the world would become what it is now. And we were looking at questioning that in a really funny, sort of unconventional way. This is all to say, essentially, in my second slide, which is about me before we actually get to the point of this entire conversation, is that I did a lot of misappropriation and open source work, which I continue to do. And I kind of blended that into a viable art practice where I started painting with things like drones, and that moved into robotic arms around 2007, 2008, just to get a sense of who I am. Here you can see kind of one of my earlier drone paintings. So I was looking at the velocity and sort of fluid dynamics of paint and pigment, and basically appropriating tools and sort of discovering at the same time Torning culture. So I became fascinated in Tor and privacy and InfoSec and OPSEC, and I started looking at eventually Bitcoin, obviously, and kind of fell into crypto with the rest of the misfit squads. But I also got galleries and museums sort of buying into and representing my work. And so the next thing I knew was I had a viable art career, basically playing with drones and robots and tech. But if you fast forward all of that kind of experience and you go into the last 2 years, what happened is the pandemic hit Europe. And I don't know how many of you in the chat right now are in Europe, but I was about 20 minutes from the Italian border, and everything hit hard and fast. So the art world shut down completely, and I realized I needed to essentially rely on my computer science degree. And sort of going from being a crypto hodler to like a crypto developer and a crypto advocate. So I started pivoting into more development with prior other layer ones. Now I'm at Algorand. And I started working with a lot of these NFT startups because not only was it remote, but it had this really interesting mix of like the interest and the tech. And I happen to have both of those fundamentals down. So I was able to basically understand and talk about decentralization from multiple verticals, being both like from the tech background, but also having this art career, I was able to interface with the artists. So I worked with a lot of NFT sites, sort of looking at the better way that they could create these environments and spaces, and from like both the technical standpoint, but from a creative sort of artist standpoint, and people that hadn't necessarily utilized or understand crypto. Okay, so now I'm going to get to the NFT part. So the kind of majority of current NFT marketplaces, if you haven't utilized or experimented with NFTs yet, is essentially that the winning bidder is named in a digital record, which confers ownership, or AKA it's minted in the blockchain. And these records, which you can also refer to as NFTs, are obviously non-fungible tokens for those of you who are just crypto curious NFTers in the crowd, is basically stored in things like IPFS. But the interesting thing that a lot of people aren't talking about is that this database is obviously decentralized, just like the majority of the blockchains we're using are decentralized. So in theory, no single kind of company, entity, or person can control this database of NFTs. As long as a specific blockchain survives, the storage stays alive and the file doesn't get corrupted somehow, or the file type isn't rendered obsolete, it works most of the time. And I think this is a lot of things that can go wrong in what is already a pretty complex system. And the other interesting thing to think about when you look at NFTs, especially from like a more traditional arts background, is that the ownership of the crypto art or the NFT confers no actual rights to the actual work other than sort of a bragging right. So for example, you don't own copyright over the artist's work. You don't typically get a physical copy. In some cases, you might get a screen, or you do get a physical copy, but it's more uncommon not. The NFT also is basically just this record of like a specific point to a specific URL. And so what I think is really interesting about NFTs from sort of the perspective of an artist, but also a technologist, is that so much of the value of the art is based off of this sort of artificial scarcity and controlling supply, right? Because like a JPEG can be infinitely copied, but it's really about this social system and monetary system, which has been designed essentially as a belief or a consensus, if you will, that things can be done better and that there's a better future. So you're like staking a lot of what you're putting into NFT is this idea that like you're betting on something being better in the future. And collecting NFTs, I think, is not unlike traditional art in the sense that it's inherently social. So what I mean by this is so much of traditional art relies on collections and openings and fundraisers and fairs. In the pre-COVID days, like everyone traveled everywhere to go to these things. And what I'm seeing with, I think, NFT specifically is like so many artists and collectors are sort of buzzing there, and like the circles and the clubs are remaining the same. But on crypto, on the other hand, I would say like also crypto art, it could be seen as reducing art to sort of the purest form, in the sense that you're buying and sorry, I've had a cold all week. You're buying and selling for sort of conspicuous consumption. And I want to get into one more like kind of kumbaya thing before I move to actual development stuff. I think that there's a really interesting notion of magic and fortune telling, especially in these times of uncertainty, and both crypto and art sort of promise, I think, this future of tomorrow, and in a way like other people are accepting of that. So if you think of every transaction on the blockchain as a prediction or a tarot reading or whatever it is that you like to kind of use as your mythology around future telling, when everything is perceived to be crumbling, the markets are where people turn, and art is where people are turning to a promise of a better future. So to some extent, the the situation around NFTs is really interesting because it's been like the perfect storm in terms of we've had the pandemic, we've had like power grids crashing down, everyone's stuck at home. We're working on our screens all the time. So what are we doing? It's like we're looking for things, we're looking for people and places and ways to connect. So NFTs have been around for quite a while. My friends who started really getting into them started around 2014, and no one necessarily cared a lot, but I've seen a lot of people working on these for years. So in slide 10, if I don't pass out from this cough, I want to talk about how we make NFTs suck less. Good morning, everybody. Sorry for my cold. So I want to kind of cover like some low-hanging fruit initially, which I think is something like proof of work versus proof of stake. This is a screen grab I pulled from a website called cryptoart.wtf. It essentially estimates the carbon footprint of crypto art's NFTs as a result of specifically like proof of work centric blockchains. Which is kind of like the fundamental blockchain right now, which the majority of NFT sites and marketplaces have been built out on. So these figures don't necessarily include production or storage costs of work. Like, for example, on-chain storage is going to be much more expensive than a centralized cloud like S3. And computers don't necessarily directly engage in the act of buying or selling. But, wow, sorry. But it's simply for the act of using like just a proof of work chain just to mint, keep track of sales and activity. So what you can essentially extrapolate really quickly from this data viz, I think, is the impact of every NFT we buy and kind of what you could do in exchange for that energy. So what's interesting to me is that looking at like actual tangible exchanges and what that could be used in lieu of purchasing that NFT on a proof of work chain. And I think to some extent, like artists have chosen to stay on these networks because the profits are just so big and they're so siloed that the ecosystem has developed so heavily, meaning that it's sort of losing the traction of other sites, so to speak. So where do we go from now? Although I work for and with the Algorand Foundation, which I see some of you calling out in the chat, I'm also like a big advocate of interoperability, and making systems even more decentralized, I think, is going to be one of the key kind of value adds in terms of bringing on and utilizing, strengthening across a massive ecosystem. So there are a lot of viable alternatives outside of ETH NFT sites. Essentially, you can look at things like Solana, Tezos, Algorand, which is my personal favorite, or Kusama. They've all built out some decent NFT plays. Some of them have evolved even to secondary markets. And I think the ones who are going to come out in front are going to be the ones who understand the need for this interoperability. So they're going to be able to work with chains and each other, build out mass adoption through ease of use, and have an easy kind of fiat on and off ramp for non-crypto natives. So one of the big reasons, in my opinion, why people are recognizing crypto right now is because of NFTs and wanting to support their favorite artists or celebrities or teams. They don't necessarily care about the tech. What they want is like an easy user experience. They want to be able to use their credit card. They want to do fiat. And NFTs are sort of one of the first like entry points into the crypto market, really catering to mass adoption. So if you look at sites like the big ones on ETH, which I probably don't have to name, the majority of those are utilizing MetaMask, and I'll get to that in a minute, but just keep that in the back of your mind. So there's also this secondary kind of low-hanging fruit, which is that there's a massive movement right now of artists on the internet who want alternatives to ETH because of gas, transaction time, storage costs, dipping baby pandas in oil. And I want to kind of talk about that. This guide is something that I published with a group of friends earlier this year. You can find it on GitHub. I'll post it on my Twitter, which is linked on all of my slides in the upper corner. And it gives you a lot of alternatives that are sustainable in terms of being proof of stake, pure proof of stake, so on and so forth. And it gives some good insights, I think, to the many ways that creatives are thinking about scaling storage and cost, as well as archiving, interoperability, and sort of all of these interesting, I think, longer term things that a lot of the sites have failed to really consider. So one of the other like low-hanging fruits is more bridges to proof of stake and pure proof of stake networks. I guess this is kind of in lieu of like, or in parallel or perpendicular to the interoperability kind of clause. One of the key value propositions of NFTs, I think, especially for creators, is it revolves around the promise of decentralization. So when an artist or an entire gallery system right now, for example, is carried by like 97% is carried by 3 or 4 galleries that do the majority of the sales and the majority of artists. I would say NFTs in theory have made some art more publicly accessible, but that's probably a lecture in and of itself. So bridges, if you're not familiar, can basically be created to suit various purposes. So they're not only capable of enabling like token 1 network to be used on token 2 network, they can also be built to exchange any type of data. So they're quite robust in terms of like including decentralized identifiers, for example, or maybe one-chain anchors, a KYC or a know your customer to another company that is built on a different layer 1 with a faster TPS, for example, or have better scaling capabilities. And bridges are really like a cornerstone of probably DeFi, and I would say the blockchain Web3, Web4 future, because they allow applications to be even more decentralized, more cross-chain, more interoperable, as they no longer limit the kind of use case by the network of origin. Another thing I really want to like push out to developers is thinking about how you can make storage cheaper. So a major proposition, I think, for a lot of artists, institutions, museums, and major collections is the implication of archiving. And what I mean by archiving is that, for example, the MoMA, or the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, has a whole team who just maintains the digital works. So, for example, they'll have an Atari video game, they have VHS tapes, they have all this work from the 70s, which at the time was considered cutting edge and like absolutely amazing. And now they run on VMs to come up with all these alternative solutions to have that work be archivable, meaning that it can be developed, it can be repeatably played or experienced through alternative means or the original means. And so I want to think about building cheaper on-chain or decentralized storage, including alternatives to IPFS, which I think is generally pretty great, but I think we can still do better. And I would like to also argue that using an URL as a primary mode of accessing the artwork is just incredibly risky from so many angles. So were the marketplaces ever to go away and their servers were to go down and their IPFF nodes are to go under, the content that essentially someone's paid a lot of money for is not necessarily accessible anymore. And with IPFS, as you know, the distributed server hosts the URL and the other computers connected to the network. So if like the issuing domain goes down, the file can still be retrieved from other nodes, but there's so many factors that can lead to broken URLs that even like a preventative measure, I think that no one's thinking much about yet, at least that I'm aware of, is sort of the implication of what will happen if these formats or legacies don't fork or aren't able to be forked, and sort of what is the alternative in terms of a total value of ownership that can be defined versus by a hash versus like an actual file. I also want to like really push to anyone out there who's looking at what can be developed is looking at supporting generative forms of art, or like what I've noticed a lot of the kind of NFT artists and collectors calling it is dynamic art. So for example, like Art Blocks is a pretty good start. From my understanding, they host generative projects from a production of verifiably deterministic outputs. So you can put like a generative script like P5 or processing, for example, and it's basically stored on an ETH chain. And so when the user wants to purchase an iteration of that project, which is hosted on the platform, they're essentially purchasing an ERC 721 NFT, which is also obviously on ETH, and it's containing essentially a providedly unique like seed, which then controls the variables for the generative script. So essentially, every time you buy it, you're getting a different seeded generative work from that, which I think is really cool. But there's a lot of artists who are working on things, for example, in like WebGL, SVG, Vector, HTML5. And it would be a major competitive advantage, sort of first mover advantage for a platform to think about. So like truly supporting generative work outside of just a few of the current parameters. The other thing, and maybe like the final thing, is access. So as I said earlier, like one of the reasons I believe crypto has hit mainstream this year was because it was really this perfect storm of like the pandemic and people being bored at home, and having browser extensions and mobile apps. And as much as a lot of people love to hate the MetaMask and other sort of like Web3/4 focused applications, with this aim, I think, to really make it relatively easy for people to buy crypto with a credit card, not have to depend on cold storage, not have to have multiple IDs set up, not having to have terminal windows up, but just like a literal plug and play, like put it on your browser, buy it with a credit card, and they can have the entire experience of utilizing crypto without necessarily having to hold crypto. So what that means, I think, is like access equals to some extent a really good UI UX experience. So people can utilize and play with crypto without having to have an extensive background or understanding of what crypto is. And I think the NFT gold rush to some extent has been mixed with all of these people sort of like looking at crypto, and we saw this boom and then the hyped up, and it was like, now crypto has this mainstream awareness, and you're seeing people like Paris Hilton and sort of all these people who are suddenly interested in how to collect and onboard and experience crypto. But I think to really have crypto become mainstream means having apps and companies thinking about way less about kind of having terminals up and this like hacker experience, but way more making it sort of this one-click Amazon-like experience, although I don't want to say Amazon is awesome either. And I see someone in the chat saying like whatever the next Apple can be, and it's actually about creating this like mass appeal exactly for people who aren't tech savvy. So to some extent, I'd argue, like, for example, for those of you who've been watching the news, like Twitter had recently the addition of NFT verification, which, whether I agree with that or not, I think is arguably just as significant as their new tipping feature, which is allowing you to tip with Bitcoin really fast, seamlessly, and through the Lightning app, I believe it's called. But over the past 6 months, you've noticed things like Jay-Z and people who are displaying these multi-million-dollar CryptoPunks as their avatars, right? So they've developed a user-friendly system for verifying essentially the ownership and provenance of an NFT. And I think that's going to really add fuel to this entire system and the NFT ecosystem more broadly. So if blockchains and NFTs become interoperable, it essentially means that, dang, you guys saw my dog. It essentially means that, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. So if blockchains and NFTs become interoperable, it essentially means that crypto will function much in the same way that we're all on the internet, which is through this interoperability and connectivity. So things become seamless, instant, and free. And that's where I'll see, and I think we'll see really the potential to develop one of the greatest global marketplaces and creator places in the world. So I apologize for my cold. This is my Twitter handle. And if you do have technical questions about developing, using, or playing with things like Algo or an Algorand, I'm happy to answer those. I'm also happy to speak about non-Algorand things, NFTs, whatever. And I'm also on Discord. And sorry, my dog didn't come in, but you do get a gift. So thanks, guys, all for your time and your patience, and I'll look forward to your questions. So let me see if there's anything here really quickly. Thanks, Chris, for giving some information on abstraction and blockchain boringness. Is that a Doge model pop? Sadly, it's a they're actually, I have two of them, and she's not going to show up now, but I have two Alaska Malamutes. So thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your time and your patience today. And again, hit me up on Twitter if you have any questions.
Thanks, Addie. This was great. We're going to transition to our next talk now.